Hello.
Jesse.
I could not figure out backgrounds, so we're just gonna have this. That's okay.
It's okay. It looks kind of industrial.
Yes, it's modern. It's rustic. I found new elevator music for us. Little loud. There we go. Hi, Elizabeth. I'm Jessie.
Hi, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Let's make sure you're a co-host. Rebecca, can you make Elizabeth a co-host?
Done.
How is everything in the Great Lakes region today? I happen to be in the Great Lakes region right now, even though I live in Tucson, Arizona. I'm actually in Chicago for a few weeks.
Cool.
And used to live in Wisconsin. Now it's been 20 some years ago that I've been gone, but I was in Milwaukee for about 7 years doing work with the AIDS Resource Center of Wisconsin. So.
That's awesome. Well, our neck of the woods has been really nice. It was like ridiculously hot for a little bit, at least for our standards, but it's really nice right now.
And you're in Minnesota?
Minnesota, yes.
Yeah.
So I live in Minneapolis.
Yeah, in Minneapolis. Yeah, my daughter teaches at Carleton College, South.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
That's really cool. Hi, Natalie.
Yeah.
Happy that
Good
you're
afternoon.
here.
Two Natalies.
Oh, yes. Hi, Natalie M, Natalie W. Happy that you're both here. Do you want to try sharing your slides?
Yeah, let me give it a whirl. Oh, it says it's disabled. Host disabled participant screen sharing.
Oh, Rebecca will make you a co-host too, so
Okay.
we'll get you powers.
Yeah, if that doesn't work, you guys have the slides, but yeah, I'm happy to do it if I get the power.
You should have it now.
Okay. Fantastic. Okay, Does that look right?
Yes, we see, this is like the edit view, which is, I don't know, sometimes it's hard to, there we go.
Okay, is this the right view?
Yeah, that's it.
Looks good.
That's the slideshow view.
Mhm.
Perfect.
So I'm expecting maybe 30 to 40 people today. There are about 60 registrants, but there's always a small group that doesn't show up. But
And folks are used to communicating in chat while the presentation is going on and the like?
yeah, so whatever you
Okay.
prefer, you
Yep.
can, I can help facilitate by stopping you and saying, hey, there's a question, or I can collect the questions in the chat and then we can have a Q&A towards the end, whatever you prefer.
We can do a Q&A towards the end, but I think we're also probably good with taking questions in the middle, but we all, especially if people do them in chat. I'm used to multitasking, so I can talk and answer things in chat at the same time. How about that?
Oh, perfect. Well, if you can see the chat and catch the questions, go for it.
Yeah, and since Natalie and I are tag teaming, while Natalie's talking, I can answer questions and vice versa. So I think that works well.
Yes.
You can get a lot of information in a short period of time, because I know we only have 30 minutes, right? If we run a little bit over, is that going to be a big problem?
Oh, you have an hour.
Oh,
we
I thought it was
stop,
broken
like,
up when we have 30 minutes and then you do 30 minutes for networking. No?
Nope. So we usually stop like maybe 5 minutes early for just like announcements. Next week we're doing this. Or we save time at the end for like more discussions, but
Okay.
really the hour is yours. And we've had people
Should have added twice as many slides then. It's actually probably good that I thought we only had 30 minutes, because we'll probably make it in an hour then. We won't go
Oh yeah,
over.
go in depth. Go on a rant. We love stories. So I am just sending the last few reminders and we'll get started just a minute here. I'm sorry if you hear dogs or babies in the background. I am not at my studio apartment. I'm at my brother's house.
I feel like hearing dogs and babies is like one of the great things about being virtual. So I feel like people never need to apologize. I always love that insight into people's lives.
You're right. I love, Rebecca has a cat that is very nosy. So we'll have meetings and I'll just be, fill up the camera. It's fine. He's part of the team now. Okay, well, it is 12 and I want us to use as much time as possible. People are going to jump in, jump out as we go here, but let's respect their time. So today we have a presentation by Elizabeth and Natalie. I'm really excited to hear what they have to share with us and the peer domains they're going to hit. They've requested that we kind of do questions in the chat box or save them towards the end, but Elizabeth is a good multitasker, so she may pull up your questions as we go along, but I'll let you introduce yourselves and go ahead and get started.
Well, good morning, everyone, or it's afternoon, I guess, now officially in the Central Time Zone. Thanks, Jesse, for that introduction. Hi, I'm Elizabeth Burden. My friends call me Liz, so please call me Liz. I always do it as Elizabeth in writing, though, so my 89-year-old mother knows it's me if she happens to come across these things on the internet. So I'm really happy to be here with you today. And my colleague, Natalie. Say hi, Natalie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Weiner. I work at the National Council on our policy and advocacy team, and I'm really excited to be here as well.
So who is the National Council, Natalie?
I can take this one, Liz, unless you want to.
Yes.
Perfect.
No, go ahead. That's
great. So the National Council for Mental Wellbeing was founded in 1969. You may have heard of us as the National Council for Behavioral Health. We just went through a full rebrand. So if this name doesn't sound familiar to you, you're not alone. Fresh new colors, fresh new rebrand. So We are a national membership organization focused on driving policy and social change. We have about 3,500 members right now that are mental health and substance use treatment organizations, and they represent about 10 million children, adults, and families. So our vision is to make mental well-being, including recovery from substance use challenges, a reality for everyone. We know that despite overwhelming need, nearly 30 million people across the US don't have access to comprehensive, high quality, affordable care when they need it and where they need it. So by promoting mental health, recovery, equitable access to care, we will work to ensure that mental well-being is a reality for everyone.
So what we're here to talk about today is a public policy advocacy and your role in all of that. I really, as Jesse said, I will encourage you to pop questions and or comments in the chat as we go. If things resonate for you, say that. If there's things that we say that, I didn't know that, but you sound good to you, that's great. And of course, ask questions as well. And at the end, we will have time for also a dialogue where people can unmute themselves and also ask questions that way. We can have people raise their hand, your Zoom hand, if you will, if you want to ask questions as well. I think that, and Jesse, you can help us identify who's wanting to speak. Wonderful. So what is it that we want to talk about this advocacy and why we do it? Is we wanted to start with a little bit of context. And so the context I would set with is this, that public policy shapes our lives and the world around us. And that is especially true for issues around substance use and mental health challenges and recovery and communities, especially communities of color, I would say, as well. And so at its root, the reasons we advocate are to foster what has been come to be called a paradigm shift around recovery from what we see on the left, which is treatment being the focus and that being where all the resources and the important conversation lies, with recovery being a small part of that, to recovery being where resources are allocated and talked about, and that it is the frame that we use for talking about lives in recovery. And treatment is a part of that and an important part of that, but there are a lot of other things that go into recovery that I'm sure all of you know as well as peer supporters. And so really it's around shifting from what we see on the left to what we see on the right. And the funny thing about this is that notion of recovery being bigger than treatment is an old concept. It predates actually the current alcohol and substance use, AODA. I'm an old timer, so the alcohol and other drug use systems. It predates the treatment systems, and in some respects, those systems grew out of older recovery movements, if you will, like of the 1970s, National Council on Alcohol and Drug Dependence and the like, that were really framing recovery as wider. We kind of lost that, and we're trying to regain it with public policy. So we're going to talk a little bit about what is being called by William White, who's one of the preeminent writers about recovery in the country. And if you haven't heard of William White, I encourage you to Google his name and go to his website and his blog and read. He's a writer, a thinker, historian, comes out of a center in the upper Midwest, actually. He was a substance use counselor for a long time. He's also a person in long-term recovery. But he coined the term the new recovery advocacy movement that's been picked up. And he describes it as a social movement led by people in addiction recovery and their allies, aimed at altering public and professional attitudes towards addiction recovery, fostering recovery-focused policies and programs, and supporting efforts to break intergenerational cycles of addiction and related problems. As I noted, and he says that the new recovery advocacy movement arose in the late 1990s in reaction to the increased demedicalization re-stigmatization, and criminalization of alcohol and other drug problems, and the resulting cultural pessimism about the prospects of long-term addiction recovery. The subsequent cultural and political mobilization that happened from that reemergence of people in recovery and people personally affected by addiction was enhanced by the growth and diversification of recovery mutual aid groups. So from 12-step fellowships to things like women in sobriety, things like smart recovery and other mutual aid groups were fostered during this time, as well as a new generation of recovery advocacy literature that is writings about what this is all about, what are the underlying principles, why do we do the work. A landmark documentary film that was called The Anonymous People. Again, if you haven't seen that, you can Google it as well. And a national recovery rally in Washington, D.C. in 2015, Unite to Face Addiction. Now, why are we calling it New Recovery Movement? Well, because that's paying homage to the earlier advocacy movements that I spoke briefly about, particularly the past work of the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence and the Society of Americans for Recovery before that. The new recovery advocacy movement signals the rise of new ideas, new strategies, new approaches that distinguish it from earlier movements aimed at addressing alcohol and other drug problems in the United States. So we stand on, as we say, the shoulders of giants in the work that we do around advocacy and public policy. Next slide, please. And so I would pose to you that the aim of our advocacy is to build recovery-rich communities. And what I mean by that is as described on the screen, that we are creating recovery hotspots around which there are public assets, individual assets, organizational assets, and community assets that allow recovery to thrive, that allow people to really build and sustain a life in recovery. Now, there's some emerging research and conversation about what's being called also a recovery ecosystem. This research is done by Ashford, Brown, and Riding, and Curtis. In 2020, they released an article that talked about recovery-ready communities. Their model was called the Recovery Ready Ecosystem Model and Recovery Ready Community Framework. And it builds on the work of recovery-oriented systems of care, which we're going to talk about in a minute, but there has been a lot of work around building recovery-oriented systems of care. That is making sure that the behavioral health system, that addiction treatment systems are all recovery-oriented. I think this work around recovery ecosystems and recovery-rich communities moves that a step further, because a recovery-oriented system of care, if you will, still focuses on system of care. It's still seeing that treatment circle, if you will, as the main emphasis. But the fact of the matter is, we all know that recovery happens in community, right? That the opposite of addiction is a return to wholeness and, a reduction in isolation. So if recovery happens in community, then that community, that recovery, the bigger circle of recovery is the focus. And so a recovery-ready ecosystem highlights the support structures that are needed in a community to support long-term recovery. Things like harm reduction, educational recovery programs, other traditional support structures. They don't go away, but it's broader than just the treatment system. And of course, peer recovery support services are at the center of that in many respects. We know that these community-based resources have been shown to positively affect recovery by orienting everyone towards the problem and creating continuity among support services. But beyond that, community-based innovations such as recovery community organizations, peer supports, other recovery support services thrive in recovery-rich communities. And there's a growing body of evidence, both practice-based evidence and evidence-based practices around successfully scaling our recovery efforts and how that impacts communities. And so recovery-rich communities, we focus on increasing access to healthy alternatives, to changing organizational and institutional policies towards being recovery-oriented, changing public policy in that same way, changing environments, creating conditions in which recovery can thrive, through sustainable resources, working together in the community, having concrete plans with achievable goals, and being clear with folks about not only what happens in their early recovery, which is important, but what happens for their long-term recovery, moving towards a recovery lifestyle, if you will, or a life fully grounded in recovery. And that means doing a couple of strategies. That means strengthening natural supports beyond those professional service systems. Again, the service systems are important, but they're only one piece. And that means supporting grassroots efforts, increasing collaboration between grassroots organizations and treatment providers through the development of community coalitions and the like, and cultivating a network of recovering communities for mutual support, raising their visibility to promote recovery success, and the like. And this all connects to public policy work in a couple of key ways because of the grassroots nature of the work. So Natalie's going to share with us a little bit about grassroots advocacy, what it is, and we'll come back and talk a little bit more about the history of the movement and how these things dovetail.
Great. So just some level setting, because we throw around the term grassroots a lot, but what is grassroots advocacy? Grassroots advocacy is a process of an individual constituent, not a lobbyist, contacting their local, state, or federal officials regarding a certain issue. And the key component of effective grassroots advocacy is about building strong relationships over time. And I know it can be intimidating to approach your elected officials, but it's helpful to keep in mind that they work for you. Your communities are the ones who elected them. You have the right and the opportunity to engage with them, and they also have the responsibility in turn to engage with you. And I'll highlight too that a key component of grassroots advocacy is also working with legislator staff, not just the legislator themselves. At every level of government, there are staff members who are the ones who are actually writing the bills, helping prep their boss for speeches, helping secure votes. So really, it's not just that direct relationship with the legislator, but building your relationship with their office and their staff over time. So I'll go through a few types of grassroots advocacy, and if folks feel comfortable, if they want to drop in the chat if they've ever engaged in any of these types of advocacy. I will highlight some of the ways that we've changed to virtual advocacy during the pandemic, ways that I think will be in sort of a hybrid in-person virtual advocacy model for quite some time. So I want to emphasize that doing grassroots advocacy doesn't always have to be you making an ask of a legislator. A great component of grassroots advocacy is just introducing yourself to them as an individual, introducing your organization to them, letting them know that you are an expert and a resource for them. And it helps to engage in positive ways too, right? Sharing updates and successes. Did you get grant funding? Are you hiring new employees? Have you had successes? Did a local news media organization cover you? And do you have a short story you can share with them? That's really helpful in relation building, because you'll see at the end, at the bottom of this pyramid, we'll have to make some hard asks, but it's actually really helpful to build that relationship, to share some positive news with them, just let them get to know you over time. We have seen a great shift in advocacy, also working with social media. We actually heard through a survey of members of Congress and their staff that a lot of members themselves actually learned how to do social media during the pandemic. They were engaging in a lot more virtual advocacy. So rather than having a comms staffer run their Twitter, a lot of members of Congress are now doing it themselves because they really liked that virtual engagement, and that wouldn't have happened even 2-5 years ago. So members of Congress, elected officials at the local and state level, they do check their social media engagement. They check their Facebook comments, they check their Twitter comments, and especially if you're a constituent living in that district, they are taking note of engagement on social media. Another change we've seen is a shift from town halls to virtual town halls. So legislators for years would host a public town hall, gather, in a local watering hole, have folks in the room to be able to ask questions. And those have shifted to being video town halls or even teletown halls where it's just over the phone. And those are really great opportunities for you to be in the same room, virtually or otherwise, with the legislator, and you get to ask them a direct question or introduce yourself. So that's a great way to keep your eye on activity. You can also customize action alert forms. If you get emails from National Council or other organizations, will often ask you to take action. And those have really increased during virtual advocacy. But I just want to highlight that a way to make yourself stand out is to also customize that. Customize the message to share your story, to give details about your work. And that's much more likely to get through to a legislator or their staff if you've actually customized it and personalized it so they're not seeing the same foreign emails. And I just want to highlight the comments here that are in the chat that are also emphasizing, this advocacy can be with regulators and state agencies, county government, city government, community organizations, school organizations. So I'm sort of starting with the broadest, but these are definitely applicable to all levels, and I appreciate that being highlighted. Some other great opportunities to engage, which could definitely affect your county and city governments as well, is to engage in writing letters to the editors and publishing op-eds. Elected officials at all levels of government read the local papers, and they will notice if there's an op-ed or a letter to the editor that is talking about an important issue. So that's a really great way to sort of keep engaged with them. One of the most impactful things we've seen in the last few years is actually having your elected officials come to your site for a site visit. And again, these days that can be virtual or in person. Some members of Congress are doing in-person site visits, some are still sticking to virtual, and obviously whatever you all feel comfortable doing, but that's a great way to let your elected officials actually see and understand the work that you do, to visit your physical locations or even tour how you do your work online these days. It really helps connect the dots for legislators to see the work that you're doing and how impactful it is. And so all of these are really setting yourself up for when you do have the hard ask, when you're asking an elected official to, change a regulation, to vote a certain way in a bill, to co-sponsor a bill, that you've spent this time building up this relationship and showing how you're engaged in your community so that eventually you can write them, call them, or have a meeting with them and ask them to take action on a specific issue. So I'll pause there and see if anyone has any questions about just these different types of grassroots advocacy. If you can drop it in the chat, that works too. And just
And in
sort
a second, okay.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, in a second, we're going to talk through how these strategies were used historically in the grassroots and the new recovery movement to date. I also wanted to point out that we want to talk about your role as an individual informed person in recovery and your role as a peer recovery support specialist, if you will. There are things as a peer recovery support specialist that you can do under the guidelines of the organization that you work for. It's really important for you to understand those as well. There is a misconception if you work for a nonprofit that you can't do any advocacy or any lobbying as a staff person, and that's just incorrect. And so it's really important. We're going to talk a little bit later about programs in general, but that programs take a look at what is the work that that may be being done by staff, including yourself, to help participants, your participants, also engage in this kind of work. and it just can't be done with federal funds. It can't be done with public funds. But if you have other funding sources, there's lots that you can do within your organizational context, within your staff role, as well as all of these things are available to you, obviously, on your own time. You know, really go for it. And we're going to also share later in the session some of the national organizations that are working in the recovery space. Yeah, and then note, check with your supervisors if you're grant funded. There may be restrictions on how to lobby, but we're not only talking about lobbying here, and we also want to make that distinction. Advocacy is very different than lobbying. Lobbying or advocacy is a part of that, but lobbying is very specific. Lobbying is when you get down to those last two things of the pyramid, writing or calling with a specific ask. Lobbying means you're talking to an elected official about a specific piece of pending legislation and asking them to support it or vote against it. That's lobbying. All the things that are above that are advocacy and are perfectly acceptable, even with federal funding, to be frank. It's really the lobbying portion, asking for them to pass bill XYZA or the like, that you cannot do. But many organizations do all of the things that Natalie was talking about that are above those last two and ask and as well. Next slide. So all of those strategies that Natalie talked about on the previous slide have been deeply embedded into the work of the recovery movement and grassroots advocacy over time. As I noted before, the history of the recovery movement is older than many think, and it's older than what we have on the slide. There's a whole recovery timeline that actually goes back to the early 1800s, but I can share the URL with you in chat if you're interested in checking it out. But this new recovery advocacy movement we're talking about traces its roots to, in part, to the Recovery Community Support Program that SAMHSA started in 1998. They had an initiative called the Recovery Community Support Program that there were grantees across the country that focused on systems change. That was the work they were funded to do, was to ensure that people with lived experience of recovery were talking to their single state authorities, to legislators, elected officials, all the folks that Natalie pointed out, as well as the community level boards and the like, around what are the needs of people in recovery and recovery community. That was what they were funded to do. And so those early grantees really worked on organizing and mobilizing the grassroots recovery community to do that work, to take seats at the table, to have these conversations in community with stakeholders and policymakers and the like around what was needed to, in essence, get to recovery-rich communities. We didn't call it that back in 1998, but that's what the work was about. In 2001, a group of them, along with the Lions Project, had the National Recovery Summit. It happened in Minnesota. It's the 20th anniversary. It was in Minneapolis, if I'm not mistaken, where people in recovery from all over the country came to talk about what do we need to do to move things forward, and this new movement was born, if you will. I wanted to note that in 2002, SAMHSA changed the Recovery Community Support Program, focused on systems change, the Recovery Community Services Program, to start actually having their grantees provide direct peer support services. And out of that initiative, the emphasis around addiction peer recovery support services, in parallel to what was happening around mental health peer supports, was born. In terms of those grantees conceptualized, developed, and piloted recovery coaching, recovery community centers, building recovery community organizations as sites of recovery, if you will. And that all goes back to that particular grant program. In 2005, SAMHSA hosted a national summit on recovery. And again in 2010, in which some of the core concepts of peer-based recovery and recovery-oriented systems of care were discussed. It was agreed by all that in order to promote health and resilience in our communities and in order to help people achieve and maintain a life in recovery, that recovery-oriented systems of care were needed at the local, state, and national levels. And so over then the past 2 decades, there's been a lot of that work at the top of the pyramid, if you will, to change the climate and the conversation that then allows those specific asks and policies to be enacted. That work has helped our understanding of what a recovery-oriented system of care, and then moving on from that, recovery-rich communities entail. But the fundamentals of the system that were outlined during that time still hold true. And I'm looking at my notes because I want to get all this right. So key things: recovery-oriented systems of care support person-centered and self-directed approaches to care that build on personal responsibility, strengths, resilience of individuals, families, and communities to achieve sustained health, wellness, and recovery from alcohol and drug problems. They also offer a comprehensive menu of services and supports that can be combined and readily adjusted to meet the individual's needs and chosen pathway to recovery. They encompass and coordinate the operations of multiple systems, providing responsive, outcomes-driven approaches to care, and they require an ongoing process of systems change. That last point is really important for us to keep in mind as advocates, because systems change often requires us to give system administrators a nudge or cover, if you will, to have the political will in the community for that change to occur, or the groundswell of common sentiment that makes it safe to take what might be seen as some groundbreaking or radical or risky steps. And again, that the lived experience of persons in recovery and family members are at the center. I need to really to share, I'm not a person in recovery, but I am a long-term ally. I've been doing this work for 30 plus years, and I'm really passionate about it. If you, hopefully that's coming through in the conversation, because I believe that recovery-rich communities help individuals in their life in recovery, and I also think it helps the rest of us too to live in recovery-rich communities. So it's a win-win for everyone. So systems change is defined as a change that impacts all elements, including social norms of an organization, public policy, and the like. And the new recovery movement is taking a systems approach. That is, it focuses on the whole picture and the wider context of recovery to achieve things by establishing sustainable mechanisms for integrating the peer voice in state addiction and health systems change and service delivery. And that means changing public policy. That means talking to legislators. That means talking to SSAs, right? Ensuring that persons with lived experience in recovery community organizations are seen as viable and vital parts of the health system, and developing partnerships that support access, especially for underrepresented and underserved communities in relation to peer support. Advocating for person-centered, self-directed, strengths-based approaches to care, and creating conditions in which creative solutions can emerge. Next slide, please. So what are some of the successes that we've seen or accomplishments of the movement? It includes things like mass mobilization. there's a large and growing constituency, that can be summed up by a pin that people often wear that says, "I'm in recovery and I vote." Right? So that's another thing that we do as advocates that helps create the environment in which change can occur. But the mass mobilization includes the more than 100 local recovery community organizations, recovery-focused social media outlets, recovery messaging training, those recovery summits, recovery celebrations at the local level. So if your organization every September during Recovery Month helps host recovery celebrations and throughout the year that are visible to the community at large, that makes it more visible. Particularly distinctive was the early leadership roles that women, people of color, members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and questioning communities, and other historically marginalized communities held and continue to hold in the new recovery advocacy movement, that it was a diverse movement as well. So some of the policy victories of which the new recovery advocacy movement was a part include the passage of the Mental Health Parity and Addiction Equity Act of 2007. There's also one in 2008 and 2010 that add updates to that. The Affordable Care Act, which organizations supported in 2010, also known as which established what is known as Obamacare. The Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act of 2017, known as CARA, and the inclusion of recovery and recovery support services in the National Drug Control Strategy plans that really are what the White House uses in its thinking of what to propose for budgets and the like moving forward. There's also been changes in local treatment systems, and hopefully I know you've seen this across the Midwest, the professional influence, increased representation within AOD-related policymaking and governing bodies at the state level, helping remove stigmatizing language from the addiction field and discourse, offering sustained pressure, if you will, to extend care models from just the acute care that it's 90 days and you're out and there's nothing else, to this notion of recovery support services being there across the lifespan of recovery. Those are just some of the things, as well as just expanding the culture of recovery, opportunities for recovery and the like. So those are some of the accomplishments, but there's still a lot to do. And so let's talk a little bit about current strategies. So next slide, please. Josephine, thanks for your question. Let's hold that till the Q&A section, but we'll come back to it about who to talk to about making it easier for families to find sober housing and recovery residences, because we'll talk a little bit about the work of the National Association of Recovery Residences as well. That's a great question. And your question points to the need for recovery residences, housing, and other kinds of things. But that broader view that I think that systems are starting to take and that we need to continue to advocate for. So the new recovery movement is advocating for meaningful representation and voice of people in recovery and their families at the local, state, and federal policy level on issues that affect their lives. So again, supporting all the things that are in that pyramid that Natalie shared, towards really making sure that there are seats at the table and voices in the room when policies are being made that affect the lives of people in recovery. Addressing national and local needs related to the adequacy of recovery supports, educating the public and policymakers about pathways to recovery, multiple pathways to recovery, what long-term recovery looks like, expanding public and policymaker support and philanthropic support, Cultivating volunteerism and activism through local communities of recovery. Again, this may be where participants and their civic engagement becomes important as well. The individuals, the peers with whom you work. And celebrating recovery. We've already noted that. Next slide, please, because I want to make sure I leave enough time for question and answers. One of the other things I wanted to point out, that we wanted to point out, was to make sure that we also grounded this in the work that you all do. I think most of the Great Lakes states are using the ICNRC, that is the International Certification and Reciprocity Consortium's certification exam as what certified peer recovery support specialists, the exam that certified peer recovery support specialists take to get their certification. I don't think that all peer supporters have to be certified. That's my particular personal bias. I think organizations and programs can be accredited. From my work with the Council on Accreditation for Peer Recovery Support Services, that's a view. But that everyone does need training and support, right? And I think that that training and support is what underlies all of that, and which also underlies certification, are the core competencies of the work. And it's important to note that in the ICNRC definition, as well as SAMHSA's core competency for peer support, advocacy is a core competency. Now, SAMHSA, the category under SAMHSA, it's promoting leadership and advocacy. It's the 11th of the 12 peer competency categories that SAMHSA has. There are 6 competencies in that category, some of which are focused on assisting individuals to advocate for themselves. And that is very important. That is to really develop the skills to stand up for themselves, to make their goals for recovery become a reality. And how do they do that within systems? And that's that individual level advocacy. But there are 2 competencies that focus on this broader policy and systems change that we've talked about, which is the point of grassroots advocacy. And the 2 are on the screen. It's educating others about the process of recovery and the use of recovery supports and the impact of recovery supports, telling the story of that, telling the story of your lived experience of recovery, as well as sharing broadly the stories of the people whose lives you touch and the impact that it has, as well as participating in efforts to eliminate prejudice and discrimination of people who have behavioral health conditions, substance use challenges, and their families. So again, this may be an organized effort, like a campaign around telling recovery stories, but I also would pose to you, and later I'm going to ask you to share what are some of the everyday ways that you do this, right? That you share your story and participate in efforts to really reduce stigma in communities. The ICNRC credentialing organization, advocacy is the very first domain of the 4 domains that people are tested on. And so I want to stop and think about that for a minute. It is the very first domain. I think that points to the importance of advocacy. Again, there are 12 competencies that if you went through the certification exam, you had to demonstrate under advocacy. And again, some of those 12 were focused on assisting individuals to advocate for themselves. And there are 3, again, that are focused on that more broader systems change. They include differentiating between the types and levels of advocacy, so the difference between individual, organizational, public policy advocacy, and at the local, state, national level. Advocating within systems to promote person-centered recovery and wellness support services. So advocating within systems sometimes is as simple as you're the person with lived experience at the table, right? You're representing in some ways the voice of recovery in the room, And over time, that relationship that you're building with other professionals, with colleagues in the field, with partners that you're working with, begins to shift their practice, their ways of thinking, their ways of doing, that allows recovery to thrive. And then lastly, advocating for multiple pathways to recovery and wellness. So programs as advocates, how does this work within the formal context of a peer recovery support services program? Go ahead, Natalie.
Great. So we highlighted a lot of these as an individual, but we wanted to share that programs as a whole can be advocates as well. So it's not that dissimilar, but we just wanted to highlight the different opportunities of introducing your program to legislators, that you can build your own database of supporters and advocates and share opportunities to them. You can host the town hall and invite your legislators there. You can organize your own Hill Day at any level of government to meet with legislators. And just wanted to highlight that these could all culminate in during Recovery Month. Of course, you can do these activities throughout the year, but I just wanted to give that as an example as you're doing the work you already do, as you're doing your celebrations, as folks are paying attention. They should be paying attention all year, but sometimes we need these things to motivate legislators to pay attention. That's a great way to sort of like culminate all of this work as a program and continue your advocacy and to gain further allies. So next we're going to talk about who's doing this work nationally.
Thanks, Natalie. So I hope that period gives you some ideas to talk about with the colleagues across your community and the state and the region. Regional rally for recovery. Wouldn't that be great? One for all the Great Lakes states. So who is doing this work nationally? If you haven't heard of some of these organizations, I believe the slides are all going to be shared with you, so the links will be live in that slide deck as well. But Faces and Voices of Recovery. Faces and Voices of Recovery was born out of that summit in 2001 that happened in Minnesota. So they are celebrating their 20th anniversary this year. And they are kind of the preeminent organization organizing recovery community organizations, if you will, around the country. But it's also good for individuals and other kinds of organizations to check in with them about the work that they're doing and policies that they're talking about. Faces and Voices of Recovery, not too long after that summit, put out what was called the Recovery Bill of Rights, which is still a document, still available on their website, and it is interesting reading, and I think it's an important foundational document, if you will, around that help to shape the advocacy efforts and those accomplishments that we talked about a little bit earlier. National Association of Recovery Residences is also advocating around sober housing, if you will, of all levels, both the grassroots and community-based ones, as well as those that may be operated by more formal systems or treatment organizations. Part of the work that they do is setting standards for recovery housing and having affiliates in each state work with recovery residences to meet those standards so that there can be more sober houses. There are of good quality, right? Getting rid of the fly-by-night ones that we know make everyone look bad in the recovery movement because they point to that as see what happens versus the success stories. The Recovery Advocacy Project is a newer project, national project that's a couple of years old now, that's really organizing individuals and family members in recovery across the country. They have some tips and hints around telling your story that we're going to summarize here in just a few minutes. I need to speed up. And then young people in recovery. I'm not sure how young people in recovery defines youngness, because I think their leaders are getting older and older. So I think young people are getting older and older too. But it's a good movement, organization, and what they're doing. Next slide. Natalie, I think next one's you, right?
Great. Yeah. So we wanted to at least give one example and highlight one piece of federal legislation that is something you could take action on now and kind of have this as a model that you could apply for other federal activity, but the PEERS Act was recently introduced. You'll see the full name, and I'll just note that members of Congress and their staff love doing creative acronyms. So, you know, a staffer took some time to figure out how to make PEERS the right acronym. So this was recently introduced. It's actually, for once, very simple piece of legislation. It would allow peer support specialists to participate in behavioral health integration services in Medicare. And to highlight just the simple ways you could take action, and you'll get these slides with the hyperlinks, is to simply find your legislator. If your member of Congress is already a co-sponsor of the bill, to thank them, just to emphasize that thanking legislators for doing the good work is just as important as asking them to take action. So we need to be mindful of thanking those folks who are taking the action we already want. And if they're not already a co-sponsor, you can call, you can email, you can tweet. The simple ask of please co-sponsor this bill. Here's what this bill does, and then share how it would impact your work and the people you work with. So this is just sort of a model that we can apply to other efforts. Liz?
And it's important for that point 3, so that the email or call or tweet come from your personal email, unless you've been cleared by your organization to do this work with your work email. Send it from your personal email, your personal Twitter account, and the like. And again, programmatically, if your program or organization is comfortable doing it, this is also the kind of thing that you don't force, but if participants are interested, you provide information about, here's the act. Here's why it could be important for you to raise your voice. Here's why you might want to raise your voice, and support that participants in learning more about this work and what they can do for their community as well. So again, yes, please check with your supervisors and your organization. Make sure you understand your organization's guidelines around this, but do always remember that you only work 8 hours a day. Hopefully you only work 8 hours a day. I'm giving you the hairy eye now. The other 16 hours a day, you're an individual with your own agency and voice that can do exactly the steps that Natalie has talked about. There's other current legislation we wanted to highlight, and if this is of interest to folks, we might be able to talk more about it on the session we're doing on later in July. Jesse will remind us when the second session is. Again, these hyperlinks will be active in the slide deck that you're given. So all of this is current federal legislation that's going on around the country as well. Marcus, thanks for a proper title. It's peer specialist, not peer supporter. There's still a lot of conversation about language, and in some states, peer specialist only relates to mental health peer specialists. The addiction recovery peer specialist is a different title. And so you'll see peer specialist, peer supporter, peer practitioner, peer worker. All of those different titles you'll see, especially in national publication, because different states do things differently. But I think it's important to keep in the context that at the center of all of those titles is a person with lived experience and specialized training that is helping others on the road to recovery. Natalie. Yeah.
Absolutely. So just to kind of summarize this a bit, we just want to give you some simple tools to start. You'll get these hyperlinks to just find your elected officials. If you're interested in our work, you can sign up for our action alerts, and you'll hear about the bills that we're following and how to take action. And then we've actually developed an advocacy handbook that goes to kind of the next steps of how do you schedule a meeting? How do you have a virtual meeting with legislators these days? What's an agenda for a site visit? So just a really detailed look. And I'm going to turn over to Liz to really talk about sort of the key component of grassroots advocacy, which is telling your story.
Thanks. And we're actually going to go through this really quickly. Again, this is something we can dig into deeper on the July 22nd session if people would be interested in doing this. If you haven't already done a telling our stories training in your organization and your community. We know that you use your lived experience and your story as a part of your recovery mentoring, your recovery coaching, your recovery planning and check-ins. And that's one way of telling your story. Those of you who come from fellowship traditions are also used to telling your story when you stand up in the room, right? That's a different way of telling your story. Telling your story for advocacy, it's important to remember it's a different context, a different audience, and so there's a different way of telling your story. And so these are some tips that came from that Recovery Advocacy Project page that you can look at. We can share as a resource. William White and his co-authors, Bill Stauffer and Daniel Torino, talk about telling our stories as essential strategy in this new recovery movement, sharing the stories in public and professional venues to change public perceptions and public policies related to advocacy and recovery. And so framing your story as a recovery story using person-centered recovery-oriented language is really important. We know the media, we know others often focus on the story of addiction. Now, that's easy to find. Stories are everywhere. The opioid crisis really brought that back to the fore, right? It's harder to find the stories of recovery. And so focusing it as a recovery story, sharing how recovery has benefited you, your family, your community as a result of recovery, today my life is, the fourth bullet point, are important. Often you'll hear some folks who have been through the Faces of Voices training, Our Stories Have Power. You'll hear them say, my name is so-and-so, I'm a person in long-term recovery. I've been in recovery for X number of years. And for me, that means I haven't used this YZ, right? And my family is able to, and I'm able to do this, that, and the other. And there is a method to that framing. They tested that out. They worked at it. They looked at it in terms of the impact of each of those components. I'm a person in long-term recovery, this many years, here's what recovery has done for me, right? In that training, they also suggest you practice telling your story and practice some more and practice some more for this particular context. Again, knowing your audience. Is it elected officials? Is it other policymakers? Is it key stakeholders that are in the room? And adjusting that story as needed. It's always your story. It's always genuine. But what resonates for them, just like when you're working individually with participants, may be different. That audience may be different. So it's thinking about framing it in that way. And in this particular context, once you've kind of shared your, as a result of recovery, today my life is, then you share why you're advocating and speaking out. Speaking out today because recovery resources are needed, because all of these kinds of things are ways you tell your story. And that's it. I think we're to Q&A, even though it looks like we only have a few minutes left. Will you go to the next slide, Natalie? Because I have some questions there that people can come on and go into chat. I'd like to open it up though for everyone, either in chat or if you want to come and speak to Josephine's question. Who in your areas do you think would be most important to advocate with around sober housing, around recovery residences, recovery housing? Do you have efforts going on in your community, your state? Have you participated in those? So any of the 4 questions on the screen, I'd love to have people, or if you have your own question.
So you can go ahead in the chat or feel free to unmute. Rick just commented City Council. I don't know if you want to unmute and speak more on that experience, Rick.
Please.
I just think for sober housing, it has to be on a local level to get the community on board. I think is to realize there's a stigma of there's a threat with people with addictions, and they forget that they're their neighbors already, you know. And the ones that are sober are going to be better neighbors than the ones that are out there using yet. Exactly,
Rick. You're spot on. And there are several resources on the NAR online site as well to talk with. But I think you're right. It's around looking for, is there an organized group of recovery residents, operators in your local that you can ally with and combine with to go meet with city councilors. Again, I think that reducing the stigma, exactly with the messaging that Rick is talking about, is setting the stage for some positive policy making and funding, if you will, to happen around increasing the number of recovery residences there are in the community. And I believe current legislation, if it's not on the list, there's some legislation working its way through the federal level that's on funding recovery residences. It's a need everywhere. Yeah. Gilbert?
Awesome.
I'm an advocate for peer support and having a common language across the state, across the universe, really, the globe, because a peer mentor, peer specialist, recovery coach, we all do the same thing, you know, and to get a common language out there to where when we do go advocate, this one word will be common and ring out in their ears, and they'll understand, you know, what it is that we're talking about. So I'm an advocate for common language. We need to get that established across the board. Yeah, peer specialist, peer mentor, doesn't matter, you know, recovery coach, you know, whatever it is that we want to call ourselves, needs to be a common language somewhere. Doctors have it, lawyers have it. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think the common language, it really is around the peer recovery support services more than the title of the profession. But I do think you're right. And I think it speaks to the fact that even though this is 20 years ongoing, it's still relatively new. And it's even newer in terms of its integration into all these other service settings and service systems. But I think you're exactly right. There's a title that goes here, right? Like doctor, you said, or doctor, nurse. But I think the various different titles that we're seeing tossed around really have to do with the differences in roles that happen within a unique context. So yes, the work is the same, but like SAMHSA has those 12 categories of core competencies, and across those categories, there are probably about 150 tasks. And no one position is going to do all 150 of those tasks. If you're working like in street outreach or overdose response programs, the work that you do there, yes, is the same as other peers, but it focuses on different competencies. And there's different needs than if you're in a recovery community center, for example, working with one participant for 2 years, or a group of participants across time. The work is similar, the knowledge that you have is similar, but so I think both need to be understood. And that's also true of other professions. An ER doc's job is very different than a family practitioner's job, and both are important, right? And so it's both setting that broader context. Peer recovery support services are important. Here's what they do. Here's how they change people's lives and change communities. And here's all the ways that that looks in different communities as well. Thanks, Chris. Recovery community needs to talk to each other and align our efforts to become a constituency of consequence. That is a good one with policymakers. And that's something that has to happen again and again and again, that these mobilization efforts need to be re-energized and re-energized and re-energized across time. I totally agree with that. And we're at time, I know. So maybe the next one we start with people sharing, and then we can move into content.
Thank you so much for that presentation. You're so well spoken, both you and Natalie. And Natalie, I know you were a fill-in for today, but I hope you can rejoin us again on the 22nd. I hope that, well, I will be sending out this PowerPoint to everyone along with the evaluation survey. And maybe between now and the 22nd, really contemplate those questions, especially the first one, what efforts are going on in your community, in your state. We all get caught up in our busy schedules, and it's hard to kind of tune into the bigger picture all the time. So again, thank you, Elizabeth and Natalie, for presenting today. Any last words that you want to leave us with?
Well, what I would say is what you just said. Between now and the next session, if you join us, please do think about those efforts, because we'd like to do this as an echo and talk about your efforts and things that, and answer some of the questions like the one about sober housing that came up more in depth rather than talk at you. I think let's talk with you next time. So send us some information. Let us know what you're working on so we can frame the conversation accordingly.
Absolutely. So next time there will be more dialogue, more stories, all of that. We're so excited. Well, I will close it out for everyone. I hope you have a great day, a great weekend. Enjoy the weather if it's enjoyable. And yeah, thank you all for being here as always. And let me know if you have any questions, concerns, missing certificates, the usual business. Alrighty, I'll close it out. Thanks, everyone.